5 terrifying true horror stories that will keep you up at night. Imagine sitting alone at night, your room bathed in pale moonlight. The house is eerily silent, except for the faint creak of wood, as if the walls themselves are breathing. But what if that creak isn't just the wood? What if something or someone you can't see is lurking just out of reach? Tonight, I bring you 5 bone-chilling stories based on real experiences. Be warned, these tales are not for the faint-hearted.
Keep your lights on.
You might need them. Story 1. The Whispering Forest. It was the winter of 2019 when Faisal, an avid hiker and wildlife photographer, decided to venture into the remote forests of northern Pakistan. Known for its dense trees and untouched wilderness, the locals called it Koi Harbet, the Mountain of Whispers. Faisal, however, dismissed the warnings as mere folklore. Just superstitious nonsense, he had scoffed when an elderly villager warned him not to enter after sundown. The first day was uneventful. The forest, though eerie, had an enchanting beauty. Towering trees stood like ancient guardians, and the soft rustle of leaves accompanied Faisal as he set up camp by a clear, bubbling stream. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and red, and soon the forest was enveloped in darkness. Faisal sat by the fire, reviewing the day's photos on his camera. As he flipped through the images, his heart skipped a beat. One of the shots showed a figure, a pale, shadowy shape barely distinguishable among the trees. He zoomed in, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But the figure remained, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at him. A sudden chill ran down his spine. He looked around but saw nothing unusual. Maybe it's just a smudge on the lens, he muttered, trying to dismiss the unease creeping over him. Yet, as the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The wind picked up, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Faisal strained to listen, but couldn't make out any words. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they merged into a cacophony of voices. "Who's there?" Faisal shouted, his voice trembling.
Silence.
Gripping his flashlight, he scanned the dark forest, the beam of light cutting through the thick shadows. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. But then he saw it, movement among the trees. A pale figure, barely visible, gliding silently between the trunks. Faisal's breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered to himself. "This can't be real." Gathering his courage, he decided to confront whatever was out there. He walked toward the direction where he'd seen the figure, his heart pounding like a drum. "It's just an animal," he told himself, though he knew no animal moved like that. As he approached, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. Leave this place." Faisal froze. The voice was clear, chilling, and unmistakably human. He shone his flashlight around but saw nothing. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. He stumbled, falling to his knees. The earth felt cold, almost alive, as if something beneath it was writhing. Panic surged through him. He scrambled to his feet and ran back to his camp, his mind racing with fear. Back at the campsite, Faisal frantically packed his belongings. "I'm out of here," he muttered, his voice shaky. But as he turned to leave, he saw them. Dozens of pale, ghostly figures surrounding the campsite, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. Faisal's mind screamed for him to run, but his body was frozen in place. The whispers grew deafening, filling his ears with a nightmarish symphony of voices. "You were warned. You were warned." With every ounce of strength he could muster, Faisal broke free from his paralysis and sprinted through the forest. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches clawing at his clothes and skin. The figures glided after him, silent yet relentless. Finally, he burst out of the forest and onto the main road, gasping for breath. The figures stopped at the edge of the trees, their hollow eyes still fixed on him. Then, one by one, they vanished into the shadows. Faisal never returned to Koi Harbet. To this day, he can't explain what he saw or heard that night. But one thing is certain, he will never forget the whispers of the forest. Story 2. The Midnight Passenger. It was a cold, foggy night in December 2017 when Zubair, a seasoned taxi driver in Karachi, received a request from his ride-hailing app. The pickup location was a desolate stretch of road near the city's outskirts, notorious for rumors of hauntings and disappearances. Easy money, Zubair muttered to himself, dismissing the eerie tales he'd heard from fellow drivers. The streets were eerily empty, the usual bustling traffic reduced to a few stray cars gliding silently through the thick fog. Zubair's car heater hummed softly, doing little to dispel the chill that seemed to seep into his bones. The GPS guided him to an isolated intersection surrounded by barren plots and unlit roads. Who would be out here at this hour, he wondered aloud, tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. A figure emerged from the fog, standing motionless by the roadside. It was a woman dressed in a simple white shalwar kameez, her long black hair partially obscuring her face. She didn't wave or signal, just stood there as if waiting for someone. Zubair frowned. The app showed no visible passenger nearby, yet something compelled him to stop. Rolling down the window slightly, he called out, "Madam, did you book a ride?" The woman nodded slowly, but said nothing. Uneasy but unwilling to turn down a fare, Zubair unlocked the door. "Please sit," he offered, forcing a smile. She slid into the back seat without a word. Her presence filled the car with an inexplicable coldness, despite the heater blasting at full power. Zubair glanced at her through the rearview mirror, but her face remained hidden behind a curtain of hair. "Where to?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She spoke for the first time, her voice soft yet chilling. "Take me home." Zubair's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "Where exactly is home, madam?" She lifted a pale hand and pointed straight ahead, toward a road that disappeared into darkness. The GPS offered no route, just a blank screen. "You sure about this?" he asked, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "That road leads nowhere." The woman remained silent, her gaze fixed forward. Against his better judgment, Zubair sighed and drove on. The fog thickened, swallowing the road ahead. The city lights faded behind them, replaced by an oppressive darkness that seemed almost alive. Minutes turned into an eternity as they ventured deeper into the unknown. Zubair's nerves frayed with each passing second. The woman hadn't moved or spoken since giving her cryptic direction. "Look, madam," he finally said, his voice tense. "I think we should turn back. There's nothing out here." "No," she whispered. "We're almost there." A sudden movement in the rear-view mirror caught his eye. The woman's hair had shifted slightly, revealing a pale, lifeless face with hollow, dark eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Zubair's breath hitched. "Ya Allah," he muttered under his breath, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold. He pressed his foot on the accelerator, desperate to escape whatever nightmare he had driven into. The car roared forward, but the road seemed endless, stretching infinitely into darkness. "Let me out," the woman said suddenly, her voice unnaturally calm. Zubair slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The woman opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the fog without another word. Heart pounding, Zubair sat frozen for a moment before finally regaining his senses. "This can't be real," he whispered, rubbing his eyes. Determined to get back to the city, he shifted into reverse and sped back the way he had come. But the road was different now, twisted and unfamiliar, lined with gnarled trees that hadn't been there before. Panic gripped him as he realized he was lost. The GPS was still blank, offering no guidance. The fog pressed in from all sides, suffocating and impenetrable. Then he saw her again. The woman stood in the middle of the road, her lifeless eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Zubair slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The car passed through her as if she were made of smoke. A bone-chilling scream filled the car, echoing in Zubair's ears even as the figure vanished. Shaking uncontrollably, Zubair muttered every prayer he knew, his voice breaking with fear. "Ya Allah, save me, please." The fog began to lift, revealing the familiar lights of the city in the distance. Gasping with relief, Zubair sped toward the safety of civilization. He reached the main road and pulled over, his hands trembling violently. For several minutes, he sat there trying to process what had just happened. The app notification chimed, jolting him out of his daze. The ride had been marked as completed, but there was no record of a passenger. No fare. Nothing. Zubair quit his job the next day, vowing never to drive at night again. He still wonders who or what he encountered on that foggy road. And every time he hears tales of strange sightings near the city's outskirts, a cold shiver runs down his spine. The haunted hostel room. It was the summer of 2018 when Ahmed, a university student in Lahore, found himself in desperate need of accommodation. His regular hostel had suddenly shut down for renovations, leaving him scrambling for a place to stay during exams. A friend recommended a cheap but old hostel located near the campus. "You sure this place is okay?" Ahmed asked as they stood outside the worn, ivy-covered building. Its cracked walls and broken windows gave it an unsettling appearance. "It's not fancy, but it's cheap," his friend said with a shrug. "Just avoid room 306. Ahmed frowned.
Why?
His friend hesitated, then whispered, "People say it's cursed. Weird stuff happens in there. A few guys left in the middle of the night and no one stays there anymore." Ahmed laughed.
Come on, man.
"Ghost stories? We're adults." Ignoring the warning, Ahmed booked the room since it was the only one available. Cursed or not, a bed's a bed, he muttered as he carried his luggage upstairs. The room was small but functional, a bed, a wooden desk, and a single window overlooking the courtyard. The air was heavy, and there was an unsettling stillness despite the occasional distant chatter from other rooms. "Nothing spooky so far," Ahmed joked to himself, setting up his books and laptop on the desk. The first night was uneventful. He studied late into the night, the silence broken only by the soft ticking of his wristwatch. By 2 a.m., he finally decided to sleep. That was when it started. A faint scratching sound echoed from the corner of the room. Ahmed sat up, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just rats," he muttered, trying to dismiss the noise. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something, or someone, was clawing at the wooden floor. Grabbing his phone, Ahmed switched on the flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing. The scratching stopped. Shaking his head, he lay back down, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But moments later, the bed began to tremble, vibrating gently at first before shaking violently. Ahmed leaped out of bed, heart racing. "What the hell?" he gasped, his voice echoing in the empty room. The bed stilled, as if nothing had happened. "I must be exhausted," he whispered, wiping sweat from his forehead. Determined not to let fear get the better of him, Ahmed sat back on the bed, clutching his phone like a lifeline. But sleep was impossible. The room had grown colder, the temperature dropping to an unnatural chill. Ahmed's breath came out in visible puffs. Then came the whisper. Soft, barely audible at first, it seemed to come from every corner of the room. "Leave. Leave now." Ahmed's blood ran cold. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Silence. Grabbing his phone, Ahmed activated the recording app and pointed the flashlight toward the empty room. "If someone's messing with me, you're gonna regret it," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Ahmed screamed, dropping his phone. The whisper returned, louder and more insistent. "Leave. You don't belong here." The window shattered, glass shards scattering across the floor. Panic surged through Ahmed as he lunged for the door, twisting the handle frantically. It wouldn't budge. "Ya Allah, help me," Ahmed prayed, tears streaming down his face. The whisper turned into a guttural growl, and from the shadows emerged a figure, a twisted, humanoid shape with hollow eyes and contorted limbs. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Ahmed's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. In a final act of desperation, Ahmed recited verses from the Quran, his voice trembling but determined. The creature hissed, recoiling as if burned. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting from the room. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dimly lit corridor outside. Without a second thought, Ahmed grabbed his belongings and fled the hostel, never looking back. He transferred to a different accommodation the next day, refusing to speak about what had happened. But the students who stayed at the hostel afterward claimed they could hear faint whispers coming from room 306 late at night. No one ever stayed there for long. When Saima, a documentary filmmaker fascinated by folklore, heard about an ancient village hidden deep within the remote mountains of Balochistan. The village, called Pirwan, was said to be cursed, its inhabitants having mysteriously vanished decades ago after a forbidden ritual went wrong. The stories intrigued Saima, who was determined to uncover the truth. Ignoring the warnings of locals, she and her small crew set off on a dusty trail leading to the isolated settlement. "We'll document everything," she told her cameraman, Farhan. "This will be the most compelling project we've ever done." The journey was arduous. Narrow dirt paths wound through rugged terrain, flanked by jagged cliffs and ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets carried by the wind. After hours of driving and hiking, they finally reached the village just before sunset. It was eerily silent. The crumbling mud brick houses stood like forgotten sentinels, their windows gaping like hollow eyes. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry leaves. "This place gives me the creeps," Farhan muttered, adjusting his camera. "Are you sure about this?" Saima nodded, though a knot of unease had formed in her stomach. "We're professionals. Let's stick to the plan." They set up camp in the village square, a dusty expanse dominated by a large, ancient tree with twisted branches. Faded carvings adorned its bark, symbols that neither Saima nor Farhan could decipher. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and an unnatural darkness blanketed the village. Saima and Farhan huddled around a small fire, reviewing footage from the day. Suddenly, a low, rhythmic chanting echoed through the air. Saima froze. "Do you hear that?" Farhan nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from over there," he whispered, pointing toward a ruined structure at the edge of the village. Grabbing their equipment, they cautiously made their way toward the sound. The chanting grew louder, a guttural symphony of voices reciting an ancient, incomprehensible language. Peering through a cracked doorway, they saw a group of figures clad in tattered robes, their faces obscured by shadow. They stood in a circle around a stone altar, upon which lay a grotesque effigy made of twisted branches and animal bones. "What the hell is this?" Farhan whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. Saima's pulse quickened. "Keep recording," she instructed, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, revealing a face that was grotesquely deformed, its features twisted into an expression of eternal agony. Its hollow eyes locked onto Saima and Farhan. "They see us," Farhan gasped, panic creeping into his voice. The chanting ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on them like a physical weight. The figures began to move toward the doorway, their steps slow but deliberate. "Run!" Saima shouted, grabbing Farhan's arm. They sprinted through the village, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. The once silent settlement now echoed with the guttural growls and inhuman shrieks of their pursuers. Reaching the ancient tree, Saima skidded to a halt, her breath ragged. "This way," she yelled, pointing toward a narrow path that led out of the village. But Farhan didn't respond. She turned to see him frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. One of the robed figures had caught up to him, its bony hand gripping his shoulder. "No!" Saima screamed, lunging toward him. A blinding light exploded from the ancient tree, illuminating the village in an ethereal glow. The robed figures shrieked, their forms dissolving into ash as the light consumed them. Farhan collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. "What just happened?" he stammered. "I don't know," Saima whispered, her voice trembling. "But we need to leave, now." They stumbled down the path, the village fading into the darkness behind them. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by the cool night air and the distant chirping of crickets. Back at the base camp, Saima reviewed the footage. The chanting, the figures, the blinding light. It was all there, captured in haunting detail. But when she tried to show it to the authorities and folklore experts, the footage was inexplicably corrupted, reduced to static and distorted noise. To this day, Saima doesn't know what saved them that night, or what ancient force still lingers in the cursed village of Pirwan. One thing is certain: some places are better left forgotten. The Whispering Shadows. It was the winter of 2021 when Armin, a software developer from Islamabad, moved into a newly built apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The building was sleek and modern, with pristine white walls, large glass windows, and a stunning view of the Margala Hills. "I finally got a place of my own," Armin told his friend Bilal over a video call, showing off the spacious living room. "No more noisy neighbors or landlords breathing down my neck." Bilal grinned. "Looks fancy, bro. Just don't forget to invite me for a housewarming." The first few weeks were peaceful. Armin enjoyed the solitude, working from home during the day and relaxing with movies at night. But as the weeks went by, strange occurrences began to disrupt his newfound tranquility. It started with the lights. One night, as Armin sat on the couch watching a thriller, the overhead lights flickered briefly. He frowned but shrugged it off as a minor electrical glitch. However, the flickering became more frequent, often plunging the apartment into darkness for several seconds before the lights returned. "Guess I need to call maintenance," he muttered. Then came the whispers. Late at night, just as he was about to drift off to sleep, Armin would hear faint voices echoing through the apartment. At first, he assumed it was the neighbors, but the voices were too indistinct, like murmurs carried by the wind. One night, unable to bear it any longer, he got out of bed and walked to the living room. "Hello," he called out, his voice breaking the heavy silence. No response. The whispers ceased, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Determined to prove he wasn't imagining things, Armin set up his phone to record audio while he slept. The next morning, he played back the recording. What he heard chilled him to the bone. Beneath the sound of his steady breathing, there was a distinct voice, a woman's voice, soft yet insistent. "Get out. Leave this place." Armin's heart raced. He replayed the clip several times, hoping it was some sort of glitch, but the voice remained clear. Shaken but unwilling to give in to fear, he decided to invite Bilal over for the weekend. "Bro, this place is awesome," Bilal said, lounging on the couch.
I don't see what you're so scared about.
Armin forced a smile. "Maybe I'm just overthinking things." That night, they stayed up late, chatting and laughing over snacks. But as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the room filled with an oppressive silence. "Do you feel that?" Bilal asked, shivering. Before Armin could respond, the lights flickered violently, then went out completely. "Power outage," Bilal said nervously. "I don't think so," Armin whispered, his voice trembling. A cold wind swept through the apartment, though all the windows were closed. The whispers returned, louder this time, multiple voices overlapping, creating a cacophony of sound. "Get out. You don't belong here. Leave now." The shadows on the walls began to shift, twisting into grotesque shapes that writhed and danced like living entities. "Bilal, run," Armin shouted, grabbing his friend's arm. They bolted toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was ice cold, as if frozen solid. Behind them, the shadows coalesced into a towering figure with glowing red eyes and elongated limbs. It let out a guttural growl that reverberated through the apartment. Desperate, Armin recited verses from the Quran, his voice steady despite the terror gripping his heart. The creature hissed, recoiling as the verses filled the room. The whispers faded, the oppressive weight lifting. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. Without a second thought, Armin and Bilal fled the apartment, not stopping until they were outside, gasping for breath under the cold night sky. "You weren't imagining things," Bilal panted, his face pale. "I know," Armin said grimly. The next day, Armin broke his lease and moved out. The landlord was surprisingly cooperative, almost as if he knew what had happened but chose not to acknowledge it. To this day, The apartment remains vacant, its windows dark and lifeless. Locals say that on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear faint whispers echoing through the empty halls. And those who dare to enter speak of shadows that move on their own, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to claim.